Picture a massive, dried-out canyon. Then suddenly, on cue, a powerful release of water begins, a real flood. Engineers deliberately open a dam and flood the whole valley. But why? In this arid region, water is worth its weight in gold. So why literally pour millions of dollars down the drain? Let us break it down. And while you are here, subscribe to the channel. The Colorado River is not just a blue line on a map. It is a system that holds up an entire region. Cities, farms, and infrastructure pull from it, and people regulate its flow in whatever way suits them. And this is where the key point starts. A river is not only water. A river is also the movement of material. Sand, silt, small stones, all of that is the river's working material, the stuff it uses to build and maintain its channel. If water flows without sediment, it behaves differently, and that changes the whole picture in the canyon. Before the big dams, the Colorado lived on a seasonal rhythm. In spring and summer, natural floods arrived, the flow surged, picked up sediment, shifted the channel, built new sand deposits, and swept excess vegetation off the low banks. Those floods were not a pretty postcard, they were a self-regulation mechanism. There was order in what looks like chaos. Once a year, the river got permission to be strong, and that is how it stayed alive. In the 20th century, the American West chose a different kind of order. They needed to store water for dry years, smooth out seasonal spikes, generate power, and guarantee deliveries. That is why they built dams, so the river would stop being unpredictable. One of the most important dams for the stretch above the Grand Canyon is Glen Canyon Dam. It backed up the Colorado and created a huge reservoir that holds water as a reserve and sets the operating pattern downstream. Below the dam, the river became much more even in level. Flood peaks disappeared or became rare. The water got colder and clearer because most of the sediment settles out in the reservoir. And here is the main turning point. The reservoir works like a sand trap. Everything that used to move downstream and feed the channel settles and piles up above the dam. Downstream, a flow goes out that has power, but no load. A flow with no load starts stealing material from the channel itself. It is like how clean water washes sediment out faster because it has nothing to carry, so it picks it up along the way. As a result, the banks and the riverbed start changing faster. In many parts of the canyon, sand features began to shrink. This is not about comfy campsites and not about tourism. This is about the channel having less of the material the river uses to build its working parts. One of those working parts is the deposits that create low-velocity zones. Behind rapids and around bends, pockets form where the water does not tear everything apart, it slows down. Young fish survive there, organic matter accumulates there, and certain links in the food chain hold together there. When there are fewer sand deposits, the channel gets harder. More bare rock, fewer places where the flow can safely spread out. Local erosion increases, and some microhabitats disappear. Along with changes in the water regime, the shoreline changes too. Without big floods, the low areas no longer get an annual cleanup. Vegetation takes hold where it used to be regularly ripped away. That established vegetation changes how the bank behaves. In some places, it stabilizes soil. In other places, it narrows the active channel. In other places, it creates debris buildup after storms inside canyons. It is a complex system, but the overall trend is one: the river loses its familiar renewal cycle. There is another layer people rarely keep in mind until they see the consequences on the ground. In the river corridor within the Grand Canyon, there are many archaeological sites. These are traces of indigenous life, homes, activity areas, trails, rock art, stone working spots. For some of these places, sand and dune deposits act like a protective layer. As long as the layer is there, the cultural layer is hidden from wind and erosion. When the layer disappears, the site gets exposed and starts breaking down faster. So a sand deficit is not only an ecological problem, it is also a cultural heritage preservation problem. Losses there are often irreversible because you cannot put a destroyed layer back the way it was. At the same time, below the dam, there were effects that first looked like improvements. The water became cleaner and more stable. Conditions felt comfortable for some fish species. In places, riverside greenery grew thicker. And that is the tricky part of the story. When you only see the upsides, it feels like the system got better. Then, slow processes show up, sand features vanish, low-velocity zones shift, the shoreline reorganizes, and the problem rises to the surface. That is when scientists and river managers formed a simple idea. If the dam took away the river's natural floods, then sometimes you need to bring them back artificially. Not fully and not forever, but in short bursts, so the river can do part of its job again. That is how controlled floods appeared. They are also called experimental floods. It is a planned water release where discharge is sharply increased for a few days. The goal is not to drown everything, it is to force the flow to lift bottom sand and lay it along the banks where it is needed. The first big experiment of this kind became a starting point. Engineers opened special outlets, increased the release, and downstream the river suddenly surged. The water turned murkier because sediment got stirred up, and material started getting rearranged. In some stretches, new deposits really did form. In key places, sand features reappeared, low-velocity zones recovered. It showed that the mechanism could still be switched on if you give it the right conditions. But something else showed up too. If you go back to the usual operating regime after the experiment, some of the deposits gradually move downstream. The river keeps working, and without regular strong bursts, the effect weakens. That led to a second takeaway. Not only the strength of the release matters, timing matters. You need to trigger the flood when there is fresh sand in the system that you can actually lift and place. Without that, the flow just passes through and does very little that helps. Fresh sand does not come from the reservoir, it stays there. It comes from tributaries below the dam, especially after heavy rains and seasonal runoff. If you catch the period when tributaries have delivered material, the flood becomes much more effective. This starts to look like a precision problem. Too early, there is not enough sand yet. Too late, the sand has already been spread out through the channel and partly carried away. The time window can be short, and that is exactly what specialists try to catch. To catch that window, they calculate a sediment budget. They estimate how much sand comes in from tributaries and how much the main flow carries away. At the same time, they monitor reference sites, recording changes in the channel and the banks. In later years, they ran new releases. Each time the idea was the same: use the short period when enough sand has accumulated in the river, then use one powerful pulse to place it, so deposits do work in the channel instead of leaving with no benefit. Over time, a more consistent approach emerged. Floods were triggered not for the calendar and not for a flashy demonstration, but based on a condition when enough material had built up. In other words, it became process management, not an event for the sake of an event. But every such decision has constraints. First, water. The Colorado is already overtapped. Drought and a hotter climate deepen the deficit, and any large release means some water did not go to other needs. Second constraint, power. The dam generates electricity, and the release pattern affects generation. When water is released in a way where part of the volume does not produce maximum power, financial losses appear, and that becomes an argument people fight over. Third constraint, engineering. High flow speeds through spillways can damage structures because of cavitation and other effects. So releases are limited in duration and discharge to avoid creating a new infrastructure problem. So a controlled flood is always a compromise. It has to be strong enough to lift and reposition sand, but it cannot be so long or so extreme that it creates unacceptable power losses, equipment risks, and water shortages across the system. Inside the canyon, they judge the effect not by feelings, but by indicators. Did sand deposits change in the right places? Did low-velocity zones increase? How do the banks behave? Which archaeological areas got extra sand cover, and which ones, on the contrary, got exposed? One important point: these floods do not return the river to the past. They cannot undo the dam, and they cannot bring back the old multi-week floods. They only provide a short pulse that temporarily restores a missing function. And the main problem remains the overall water deficit. The Colorado serves a region with millions of people, agriculture, and industry. At the same time, the climate has gotten drier, evaporation is higher, and reservoirs are under pressure. The old water allocation rules were written in an era when the population was far smaller and expectations were different. Today, those rules clash more and more with the river's physical reality. There is less water than everyone needs at the same time. So an unpleasant outlook appears. If the flow below the dam gets too weak, changes will accelerate. The shoreline will get drier, the ecosystem will lose some resilience, and pressure on groundwater will rise. In that scenario, the Grand Canyon will still be rock, but the river corridor will change noticeably. Less water means fewer ways to sustain familiar processes, less sediment transport, more local degradation in the areas that depended on sand. And this is where controlled floods look like an attempt to keep the system functional. They help preserve key sand elements, support low-velocity zones, and partly maintain the sand protection over archaeological layers. But even the most successful release will not replace a steady inflow of water or fix an overstressed water use system. It is a tool that buys time and gives a chance for bigger decisions. And big decisions rarely sound exciting. That is water conservation and higher efficiency in agriculture and cities. That is cutting leaks, reusing treated water, tighter planning, and sometimes shifting allocation between sectors. Those measures spark conflict because they hit habits and money. But without them, any river experiment turns into trying to repair a machine that keeps running at the limit. If you boil the meaning of this story down to one nerve, it is this: the Colorado below the dam suffers not only from a lack of water, but also from a lack of sand that the water is supposed to carry. Without sand, the river loses its ability to maintain the channel and protect part of its corridor. And that is why they create floods not for beaches and not for fun. They do it because a river is a process, and a process needs materials and periodic pulses of force. When those pulses were removed, the system has to be switched on by hand. From the outside, it looks like strange waste, dumping water in an arid region. But on the inside, it is an attempt to preserve what would otherwise degrade slowly and quietly, until one day it turns out there is no going back. The most important thing in this whole topic is honesty about goals. A controlled flood does not solve the Colorado's problem as a whole. It solves a narrow task, supports sand elements of the channel in key places when nature has delivered material through tributaries. And it also shows the limit of human control. You can build a dam and smooth out a river, But you cannot cancel channel geometry, sediment transport, and the link between water and life in the canyon. Either the natural mechanism works, or you have to imitate it at a high cost. If you hear news about a new release, it helps to ask the right question. Not why are they making a flood, but what exactly are they trying to restore and under what conditions? Is there sand? Is there water? Is there a time window? And is there political will to pay for the compromise? Because the compromise will have to be paid for either way, either with water and power now to preserve processes in the canyon, or with losses later, when channel degradation and damage to cultural layers become more visible and more expensive, and some of the harm turns out to be irreversible. That is why the Colorado story is not only about engineers and dams. It is about how a region learns to live with scarcity and how natural systems force people to rethink approaches when the old rules stop working. In short, the river below the dam has become too well behaved for its own good, and controlled floods are an attempt to give it back a little of its natural work, while there is still something left to save. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which option feels more honest to you. Imitate floods and conserve water, or admit the system is overloaded and change the allocation rules.